Hello and welcome again to The Shed and 10 Things About Writing. Today I'm going to talk about accents in dialogue. And it's a thorny subject because what happens if you want one of your characters to have an accent? How do you handle it? Well, there are a number of ways to do it. Some people have done it very well, other people have done it very badly, and it's important to understand when it works and when it doesn't. Now, basically, you have to think about what an accent means to you. An accent is not just phonetics. It is cultural, it's based on vocabulary, it's based sometimes on generation, it's based on geography, it's based on time. It can be all of these things, and it's really important to know what you are talking about before you try it. It's not something that can be easily faked. The world is full of reasonably successful writers and sometimes very successful writers who have never quite handled or understood accents. And really the bottom line is, if you don't understand it, and if you don't have the time or the capability or the desire to research it and to get really into the subject, then just don't use them at all. It's quite possible to write a whole book and to simply go, so-and-so had a pronounced Scottish accent. You don't need to remind yourself to write, "Och, I the new," every time you have your Scottish character talking, because A, it will sound disrespectful, it will be a silly caricature, and most of all, it will get your readers to double take, to project themselves out of the story. It will distract them from what is being said to how you chose to express it, and in some ways the ridiculous way that you chose to express it, and there they'll be, out of the story. You will have lost them, in some cases for good. Now, sometimes it's important to use accents to give variety to people, and sometimes if you are talking about somebody whose culture might be defined partly by the way they speak, although you do have to be a bit careful here not to fall into awful stereotyping. But if you do want to access that part of somebody's culture, somebody's background, somebody's upbringing, then it's really quite important. You do the same as you would if you were writing about somebody's racial diversity. Accent diversity sometimes does overlap with race, and there is no harm at all in asking somebody who knows better than you do whether you have got it right. Also, less is often more. I see a lot of writers, particularly beginning writers, and this is a mistake that I've made too, and I have learnt from it, and I wouldn't do it again, who try too hard to get an accent across. And what they end up doing is writing something that sounds cartoonish and silly, and is also distracting and ugly on the page. And when I say ugly, I mean, imagine a page full of phonetically rendered accent speech. What you've got a lot of apostrophes there. You've got a lot of bits where words have been tightened up and shortened. It looks ugly. It looks strange on the page. It looks difficult to read. You don't want to do that to your readers at all. Your readers want the reading experience to be fluid, to be effortless. Also, if your book is ever going to be an audiobook, your audiobook reader doesn't need any of that. Your audiobook reader will almost certainly be a professional actor who knows how to do voices and accents. In fact, in some cases, if you haven't specified an accent for your character, they will give them one because they like to diversify with voices, and that's fine. But it's not your job as a writer to do an audiobook reader's job. So if the accent is important, less is more. There are ways to convey accents, not necessarily through phonetic writing, although some people do it very well, but they are nearly always people who had that accent from early childhood and know exactly where the line is. But it's also perfectly possible with small, elegant, well thought out touches to talk about someone's accent without filling your page full of extraneous, ugly, literal-minded stuff. Now, I'm going to take an example of bad use of accenting from one of the most successful children's authors of all time, writing an adult novel here. This is J.K. Rowling writing as Robert Galbraith. It's a passage that's been quoted, and not necessarily in a good way, quite a lot this week, which is why I decided to do a little bit of a talk about accents here. No insult implied at all to J.K. Rowling, who is far more successful than I will ever be, and for all kinds of reasons that I don't necessarily understand. But here we have a piece of dialogue heavily accented in a way which I have to say would turn me off instantly as a reader, and which is just frankly not great style. And this is how it goes. Well, he had these head pains and he was definitely nervous. Depressed maybe, said Janice. Everyone had blamed him for what had happened to that poor girl who killed herself. But I don't know, ... and some of me other neighbours told me there were young men coming in and out of his flat. There you are, said Irene triumphantly. Queer. Might not have been that, said Janice. Could have just been his mates, or drugs, or stuff falling off the back of a lorry. One thing I do know, 'cause people talked. Locally, the husband of that girl who killed herself was knocking 12 bells out of her. Okay, I have exaggerated it because I can't show you the page here, so I've had to exaggerate the bits that are phonetically rendered. But you see what I mean? There's a whole bunch of this stuff and it continues for pages. There are a number of things wrong with this. For a start, all those apostrophes with missed letters and shortened words are very distracting. Also, and it occurs to me when I'm reading it out, and even when I'm trying to read it out in a more sympathetic way to the text, it is impossible to tell from what the author has done here what accent she's actually doing. There is some, well, because I do have an accent, because I have a Yorkshire accent, I think of it partly as being Yorkshire, but it also sounds like it could be Cockney. It could be almost anything. And so really the only thing that's being conveyed here is somebody has an accent, which given the context is a bit problematic anyway. But, you know, without going into that, it's not doing what it was supposed to do. It's not conveying the way that person speaks. All it's conveying is the author's inability to write dialect, and it is very, very distracting for the reader. Now let me compare this with another piece. And this is not an accent I can do, so I'm not really going to try. But then the author hasn't really tried to convey the accent phonetically either. Instead, she has gone into other things. She has looked at the rhythms of the language, and somehow the accent is conveyed. And she's also described the voice of the speaker, which is quite important. And having conveyed that, she allows the accent and the small parts of the accent that she has written out to slip away, because once she's established that this character is Cockney, she doesn't really need to remind you, because you, the reader, you already know this. And this is from Nights at the Circus by Angela Carter, and it's one of the best voices, I think, in literature. This is Feathers, the Cockney Venus, and this is her speaking initially, and this is how she is introduced. Lord love you, sir, Feathers sang out in a voice that clanged like dustbin lids. As to my place of birth, why, I first saw light of day right here in smoky old London, didn't I? Not build the Cockney Venus for nothing, sir, though they could just as well have called me Helen of the High Wire, due to the unusual circumstances in which I come ashore. For I never docked via what you might call the normal channels, sir. Oh dear me, no, but just like Helen of Troy was hatched. Now, it goes on for some time. I'm not even trying to do a Cockney accent because I can't. And yet you can see from the dialogue that this is what the author's conveying. And when you look at it on the page, you can hear that twang. For a start, yes, she is using some slightly cartoonish Cockney expressions like Lord love you and this kind of thing, but this is okay, partly because the character is larger than life and has a slightly cartoonish quality to her anyway, but also because in some ways it is necessary to establish the tone. Having done that, the only apostrophe I can see here is in law, love you, sir, and that's the first word. The first word is shortened. Just to remind you that, yes, she's a Cockney. She's going to be shortening words. Okay, after that, I can see a whole paragraph here. There is no shortening at all. However, the reader, having already established that this is Feathers and this is how she talks, you, the reader, will contribute the sound in the same way that an audiobook reader would contribute the sound, having been told, this is a Cockney character who talks in a certain way. And that's all you need to know. That's it. It's done with the lightest of touches, and the cadence of the speech contributes also because she has certain mannerisms that have been looked at in terms of how somebody from that region, from that time would have spoken. And it's musical, and it's fluid, and it's strangely erudite. Because unlike J.K. Rowling's characters who are talking like cardboard cutout, stereotypical working class characters, this working class character has much a wider vocabulary. She has an interesting vocabulary. She is not being judged on the page for the way she speaks. And this is quite important, and it's going into areas of avoiding stereotype as well as areas of writing good dialogue. But it is perfectly possible to do it. And I would say that the phrase that really confirms it for me is, Feathers sang out in a voice that clanged like dustbin lids, and that was all you really needed. That, and the knowledge of where she was from, that's all you needed. Nobody needed to write anything else, any other kind of weird apostrophe, shortened words, ugly words. None of that was necessary. She nailed it. She nailed it right there. And so can you, if that is what you want to do. If you want to write a whole book in dialect, and some people do, make sure that it's a dialect you know very, very well indeed. And here again, it is not necessary to fill your book with apostrophes. Some writers just leave them out. Stephen King leaves them out all the time when he's writing main dialect. He just leaves the apostrophes out because he knows that they're not really necessary except as a grammatical tool. But this isn't about grammar. This is about rendition of tone and of vocal mannerisms. I would say that perhaps he does it just a little too much. But again, this is in some way a matter of taste. But yes, less is more when dialect goes. And if you don't feel that dialect is appropriate for you because you don't have the appropriate knowledge, then it is also fine just not to have it at all. Just to say this character had a strong Scots accent and just leave it at that. That works too, and the readers will thank you. Till next time, happy writing. Goodbye.